missionary executive, and beloved professor of missions here at Luther Seminary. Dr. Burgess was active in missions from the 1920s to the 1980s and was instrumental in establishing so many of the international relationships that are so important for us at the seminary today. The Burgess Lecture brings scholars in global mission to Luther Seminary. His lectures are designed to help us as the church to interpret the task of global mission today in the light of Christian tradition and the historical experience of the church in the world. In the last 18 years, we've been graced by the presence of 14 internationally known scholars of mission. And today we are graced again by another of large proportion. Not stature. I mean physical stature. I'm going to get myself into trouble here if I continue. So what I'm going to do right now is to turn it over to somebody who is much better at doing this, Dr. Alan Paget, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Good morning. Welcome to our lecture. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Mark Heim, who's a wonderful theologian, a warm teacher who's mentored not only his own students, but many younger scholars in the field of theology of world religions. Mark is currently the Samuel Abbot Professor of Christian Theology at Andover Newton Theological School, where he was also a student and has been a faculty member for many years. Currently, he is a fully funded Henry Luce Fellow on sabbatical and away from all teaching and administrative responsibilities for a year while he works on another fine theology book. Dr. Heim is not only an outstanding American theologian, but a warm and helpful teacher and friend that I've known for many years and admire. So I'm very happy he's here today. I believe you will thoroughly enjoy his stimulating lecture. His recent work is focused on the theology of religions, that is, on thinking through classic Christian doctrines in dialogue with a world of many religions. Two of his books, Salvations, Truth and Difference in Religion, and also The Depths of the Riches, a Trinitarian Theology of Religious Ends, are now required reading in this growing and interesting field of a Christian theology of world religions. We're very happy and proud to have him here to speak to us with our annual Burgess Lecture, which is entitled Account for the Hope, Mission at Home with Pluralism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Heim.
Thank you, Alan. It's wonderful to be here with friends like Alan, new friends like Stephen, many others I know in your community here and respect so much for their work. Now, is this working? You can hear me all right? One of my favorite stories is about the Episcopal Cathedral in Boston. On some high holy day, the presiding bishop was a celebrant, and he was testing the microphone, as we often do before these events, and he said very softly, he thought to himself, there's something wrong with this microphone, to which the well-trained Episcopal congregation all responded in unison, and also with you. So I know that I'm going to take up some large topics with you today. I'm sure that it's possible there might be something wrong with me in my presentation, my thinking, and so on. And if so, please sift whatever is not of use to you and hold fast to what is good and of edification for you. I want to say a few words about what it is I'm intending to do. I hope all of you have gotten to, there's just a one-sheet handout that hopefully will be of some assistance in following where I'm going. If you don't, maybe you could make your need known and Michelle would help you. George Lindbeck, the very noted Lutheran theologian, once wrote of his perplexity in studying early Christianity, where he said he observed here were people, these early Christians, who were on fire to share the gospel of Christ with all those around them in this Hellenistic world of dizzying religious pluralism. They were on fire to do this as a matter of life and death, an eternal destiny, but they were at the same time, Lindbeck observed, these were all people who had parents, friends, relatives, neighbors, who had lived and died in other religious faiths. And yet, Lindbeck says, nowhere can we find much, if any, sustained attention to the kind of question we would think they would be wanting to ask, which is, what is the fate of those people who died without knowing Christ or without participation in the Christian church? Well, Lindbeck's question was, how could you account for this fervor on the one hand, the fervor of mission and evangelism and sharing the gospel of Christ, and on the other hand, the equanimity, the comfortableness, the at-homeness in this world of diversity and other options? And he went so far as to wonder whether those early Christians didn't have some unrecorded theological conviction that they didn't share or write down that sort of made sense of this for them. Perhaps something about Jesus' post-mortem appearance to those who had died and so on. Well, really, my question for our reflection today is to ask, what would be comparable in our age and our context for Christian witness and mission today? What would it mean to be Christians who are active and alive in service and witness in the name of Christ, and yet also at home, comfortable with the variety of religious paths around us, with the variety of religious achievements, even of those of our neighbors and friends, not threatened by that reality, not despairing over pluralism as a flat denial of the gospel, but not complacent about it either as a more or less all the same thing in the end anyway. How exactly do you do that? Whether we're pastors or missionaries or lay people. In a context of religious diversity, can Christians enter dialogue with an openness to learn from others that isn't just a pose adopted for the occasion, but a genuine implication of our deepest convictions, not an add-on, but part of the Christian life itself? Such a theological base would provide a rationale to pull us towards interfaith relations if we feel inclined to avoid it or are threatened by it or upset by it. But it would also give us a framework that could incorporate what we learn from interfaith engagement that we may already be involved in. And in fact, as we look around, we know that for many people in Christian communities and congregations, there are many people who are actually involved in other religious traditions through some measure of practice or study or vicarious experience with friends or family members. And for them, the question is not whether I should be doing this. The question is, what do I make of this as a Christian in terms of my Christian faith? So I'm here today to share with you my own answer to that challenge, which really revolves around 2 points, 2 things that I've learned from my own interfaith experience. And perhaps it shouldn't have taken me that kind of experience to learn them, but it was the occasion for me. The first is, in my interfaith dialogue and involvement, I came to realize, in a way I never had before, the specific, distinctive character of Christian salvation. Living in a somewhat Christian world, to me, salvation had always meant sort of every possible good thing that could come would all be somehow wrapped up in this thing that I called salvation. It was only in interaction with people from different traditions that I began to realize that, well, actually Christian salvation has a rather distinctive profile. It's not something that everyone assumes, that everyone seeks, or that everyone wants in our world of diversity and pluralism. And second of all, I realized that Trinity, this fundamental conviction in Christian faith and tradition, Trinity was the Christian theology of religions. It was the basis and the framework within which we could understand this situation and our place in it. So that's what I want to try and lay out for you in relatively brief order today. You've given me 45 or 50 minutes of your precious time. I hope I can give you at least the suggestion of something to think about as you address these questions in your own context. And the heart of what I'm doing is I'd like to summarize 3 dimensions of the koinonia of the Trinitarian life, the fellowship of the Trinitarian life, and 3 human images that reflect that. We might call these analogies, or whether our analogy is going, as Barth would have it, from God to us or from us to God. It's not my question or my problem today. Just in terms of communication, I want to try and outline these three dimensions so you understand what I'm talking about. These are three dimensions of the divine life of the Trinity. And there's an analogy I'm going to use from human experience to try and make this clear. The first dimension I'm talking about is what I call emptiness and immanence, which I would say the three divine persons each empty themselves to allow the indwelling of the others, and they each have an immanent presence within the others. Coherence, perichoresis, this is the language we use to talk about this. But if we were to seek an image of that in human life, we would liken it to connections, I believe, that we would usually think of as non-personal because of they're such an elemental sort. So for instance, someone might receive a blood transfusion from someone else. I've been the recipient of such a gift in my lifetime, perhaps from someone I'd never met, never knew. This was a significant, and for me, a life-saving relation, but it takes place at an organic level, a level far separate from any conscious or explicitly personal relationship. Or you might be lying in your bed at night, somewhat asleep if you're the parent of teenagers, and yet at some pre-conscious level, you know whether they've returned to the house or not at a given particular moment. There's a kind of pre-conscious, non-personal awareness. And just as human personhood isn't discernible at the level of molecular interaction or blood types and so on, we could say that God's personal nature also encompasses a kind of pre-personal dimension. Secondly, within the Trinity, each of the three persons encounters the other in a kind of freedom with a unique character, a distinctive identity. The relationships are asymmetrical because each one is not a copy of the other. In human beings, we see a likeness to this in the dimensions of direct personal encounter, in which we meet, we converse, we share intentions and emotions, we read each other's faces and understand our meanings. We meet as distinctive others that honor and enact our identities in exchange with one another. We do this face to face, or we do it through a medium like writing or art. It's what we ordinarily think of as personal encounter. And third, the divine persons don't only share that divine life process of that first dimension. They do not only encounter each other in a kind of free uniqueness, they also enter into communion with each other where they indwell each other as different. The incarnation for us is our window into that Trinitarian communion and the path that opens our way to participate in it. Now, I would say we have an image of this, a shadow of this in our own experience when empathy and intimacy with someone give rise to a vicarious capacity in us to share their inner life. Their characteristic responses, their characteristic feelings begin to arise in us also as a kind of second nature. I'll give you a humble example of this. I walk into a store recently. I'm walking down the aisles. My eye is drawn to a musical offering, a CD by a particular artist. And without any reflection, without any thought, I have a deep welling desire to purchase that CD. Only upon a little reflection do I realize I don't like this artist at all. I would never want to have this music in my home. Where did that impulse come from? My daughter loves that music. And I'm close enough to my daughter that her reactions and her desires and her wants, in a way, have become kind of second nature to me. I didn't go through a syllogistic exercise of inferring my daughter's desires. My daughter's desires have become, in some way, my desires, such that I have to disentangle them from my own. Think, no, don't spend your money on that for you unless you want it for her. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. All relations of deep love and friendship are marked by this dynamic. But for us, it's manifest above all by our incorporation into Christ through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, because that's the way we can share in Christ's relation with God and Christ's relation and love for others. Okay, so this is the headline of my talk to you today. In God's relation with the world, with creation, God manifests in a proportionate way all of those three dimensions. Those three dimensions exist in God's inner life, if you will, in the Trinitarian love and communion. But they're also present in God's connection with the world. They're present in our human lives as part of the image of God given to us in creation and broken by sin. But they're present in the providence of God, in God's presence and action in the world, and we may find them in the religions. So I've also learned that in teaching, it's always a good idea to at least forestall the one major misunderstanding of what you're saying. To make clear the one thing you do not want people to take away from your talk. So here's that headline. The one thing I don't want you to take away from this talk is the idea that there's a separate relation with different persons of the Trinity. You know, there's a God the first person relation, there's a God the second person relation, there's a God the third person relation. That's not what I'm saying. Okay? Because God is Trinity, God has all of these dimensions, and all of these dimensions are manifest in God's interaction with the world. But they're not one to a person. Okay? It's the disclaimer. Okay, so let's talk about these three dimensions, and that's really what the handout is meant to focus on. First of all, the dimension that I've called analogously non-personal. The relation of creation, God's relation to God, to the world as creator, reflects this dimension. Because on the one hand, God withdraws to make space for creatures to have their own being, then freedom, distinct from God. We are what we are because God has given us room to be that. God has opened up, if you will, the space of God's absence for us to be something additional and separate and distinct from God. There's a divine absence, a distance between the creator and the creature that makes freedom and identity possible. That's one face of this. And on the other hand, God practices a universal immanence in which God sustains every being by divine power and order. Now, these relations are universal and hidden. God practices an active absence and an anonymous identity in creation. There's no corner of the leaf that has "made by God" written in the corner. There's no cloud spelling across the sky to make it unmistakable who's the author and originator of the universe. God is withdrawn to give creation space, and God is constantly, but hiddenly, active in everything that is. Now, humans can respond to God's manifestation in these dimensions in two different ways. First, that contraction to make way for creation makes possible a valid human insight into the insubstantiality of all created being. If we meditate spiritually, or if we investigate scientifically what's really at the bottom of things in the universe, we can rightly conclude that really what's there when you get there is not really much of a there. It's impermanence or emptiness at the base of things. Quantum mechanics, what's the absolute fundamental nature of this good, solid, subsistent reality here? Well, it becomes a pattern of probability and energy. It's not anything really all that substantial. All enduring distinct identities are found to be without substance. And the conclusion and the practice that's based on that conclusion is characteristic of Theravadan Buddhist understanding of the nature of things, of nirvana. And insight into that dimension is far more developed in Buddhism than in any facet of Christian tradition. So what I'm suggesting to you is that the Buddhist vision of emptiness is an accurate description of one aspect of the relation in which God stands to the world, a fundamental dimension of contingency and distance. And we find in Buddhism an isolation and purification of that dimension. To realize such emptiness is to cling to nothing, not even one's identity, and so to be delivered from suffering and estrangement and relationship. There's a second way to apprehend this dimension of divine relation, And here's what's most profoundly grasped is not God's withdrawal, but God's sustaining constant presence in everything that is. The constant dynamism of the divine life that upholds the world is taken as the substratum of one great reality. From this perspective, it was a mistake to think that emptiness was the real story. Every individual part may change and pass away like cells in one body, but the one self goes on. If we look deeply into nature and try to find out what is really at the base of things, by meditation or by science, we find not an emptiness, but an underlying structure, present alike in everything that is. If you follow the quantum mechanics line, you could equally well say, well, what's at the bottom of everything is not flux and emptiness, it's a universal, mathematical, intellectual, rational structure that has shaped and ordered everything according to a particular plan. So the Advaita Vedanta tradition in Hinduism expresses that perception powerfully. Brahman, the one unshakable reality, sustains all things by pervading all things and being all things. And if pursued intensely and separately, that insight suggests an end in which the small I of any particular creature resolves into perfect identity with the one absolute being. The creature can realize the impersonal immanence of the divine as their sole reality and yield back all unique identity, all relations into that oneness. So either of these insights I've just described can lead to reasonably to the same conclusion, which is, whatever the nature of things is, that's my nature also. I am that. You are that. We all are that. All things are empty, or all things are literally divine. That samsara is nirvana or Atman is Brahman are two distinctive religious conclusions born of that kind of wisdom. And they're developed within Buddhism and Hinduism more purely and distinctly than ever in Christianity. So that's the first line on the handout. This one vein, one frequency of God's relation with the world, whose motto we might take to be, "Thou art that." This non-personal immanence and emptiness. But there is another dimension, second that I've pointed to here, where God's relation with the world in the impersonal, non-personal way is a kind of background or a stage onto which God can walk as an active personal presence. It sets the stage for an encounter between God and human beings, where God becomes a thou to us. This is the personal dimension of God's relation with the world, and it also has two sides. Under the influence of the biblical tradition, we think of this always in terms of encounter with God as a person. And obviously, this is the vision Christianity shares with Judaism and Islam. This is the God of biblical and Quranic traditions, an agent who speaks with us, who acts in history. But it's also possible to conceive a specific transcendent divine order without an actual personal being who expresses it, a divine will without a God whose will it is, so to speak, the Tao of Taoism, or the Logos in Stoicism. Thus, at one end of the range, there's revelation of a transcendent moral order. At the other end, there's the personal God who is the subject of loving encounter and the source of law and guidance. The key point that distinguishes this dimension as a whole from the first dimension is that it allows for, indeed it requires, contrast and tension and narrative. Specific historical revelation marks the divine and relation with the divine off from other possibilities. Divine word or image points to the fact that the transcendent reality is not empty, nor is all being already in perfect identity with it. There's a distance between us and God that must be traveled by moral and spiritual transformation. Revelation bridges a gap between God and us, pointing a way for change and development. The motto is not, "You are already that," realized by insight the character of existence. The motto is, "Become what you are structured or called to be. Be transformed, be renewed, be changed, be reconciled with God." The Trinitarian perspective suggests that what's apprehended in these cases is the external unity of the Trinity. It's God's personal will, the will which each of the persons of the Trinity manifestly share in their relation with the world. Human reception may focus on the content of what God wills or on the character of the one who wills it. But in either case, faithful response to the revelation of God is a personal response to a personal God. And third, what I call this communion dimension, the koinonia dimension. Christian faith presupposes both of the things I've just described. That's important to underline. It seems to me Christian faith presupposes these things. They are built in to what the nature of Trinity itself is. But Christianity specifically extends either of those notions with two decisive steps. The first is the conviction that the decisive revelation of the personal God is itself a living person, Jesus Christ. So the principal revelation of the personal God is a person. And the second step is the confession of God as Trinity, which finds that single personal divine itself grounded in a communion of persons. Or as one of my students, who had gotten rather tired of hearing this repetition from me, said, I get it. It's persons all the way down. Right. This is what impels Christians to confess that God relates with creation in the dimension of communion, and that salvation is the fulfillment of relation in the communion dimension. So for Christian mission, it seems to me, always needs to be guided by the hope, the Christian hope, and the name for that hope is salvation, and the content of salvation is communion, koinonia. We can confess this only because we see it as true in the incarnation of the Word and in our own relationship with Christ. But we're helped to know it by what we experience in our relationships with each other. We know that we can rightly say of certain aspects of our own willing or longing or loving that they seem to arise in us more from the effects of shared life with a friend or another than they actually develop from us ourselves. You know, they say one good way to identify someone in a crowd who's fallen in love is to look for the person who's behaving better than they normally do. And there's a lot to be said for it. There's something about the experience of love that seems to evoke in us a desire to include others in that circle of joy and happiness and sharing. And an impulse arises in us that doesn't seem to come from our past experience, but comes from the other person's presence in us. This isn't an abstract process. As I indicated earlier, it's not anything that a parent thinks out as a part of their relationship to their children. It becomes a second nature in us, an indwelling in us. All the language that's used in the New Testament, our relation between Christ and the believer, in some way is faintly prefigured in the kind of experience I'm talking about here. So the unique aspect of this dimension of relation with God is defined by the fact that we only have it by sharing it with others. We can have koinonia with God only through koinonia with others. This doesn't just mean that we can't be saved apart from Christ, though it certainly means that. For the typical feature of our communion with Christ is that we discover a new openness in us toward neighbors and toward enemies, a response that we can hardly credit as coming solely from us, unless it's coming from Christ in us, by virtue of Christ becoming a kind of second nature in us. The effect of communion is openness to communion. We're not only changed through our koinonia with others, but that communion characterizes the final eschatological fulfillment that we hope for and long for. Which brings me back to salvation. As I said, in my experience of involvement with other religious traditions, it was a profound discovery for me that we were really not all arguing about which was the best way to get to the agreed upon goal. There was really some fundamental disagreement about what was that desired goal? What was the nature of fulfillment? And it brought home to me that I realized in this kind of comparative context that salvation has a distinctive character to it, this communion dimension. No individual can or could realize fullness of relation with God in all of these three dimensions I've just described to you. No one of us could ever realize relation with God in all those dimensions to the fullness that's possible, unless we did so through communion with others, who each had, in some measure, a different profile of their ability to do that and their fulfillment of this. The communion of saints is not an assembly of individuals who have each repeated an identical unity and reconciliation with God. It's a living exchange in which one person's participation in God is enriched and amplified by the distinctive character of another's participation and relation with God. This is why, you can see what sort of in my sort of journey here, I kind of one by one rediscovered all the basic fundamental teachings of Christian theology, which I should have known already, but they come home to me in a new way. This is why the concrete body of the church has been regarded as fundamental to the Christian life, to salvation itself. No salvation apart from the church. What does that mean? Not institutional membership. It means apart from the koinonia, a participation in others' relation with God, there can be no final fulfillment, no salvation in the communion dimension. The way that we can participate in the divine life, a divine life that overflows all finite capacities, is through this mutual indwelling with others. It's a little bit like I'm told that sort of radio telescopes, no one can sort of put together a picture of galaxies and so on. You ought to have a lot of parallel, different computers sort of doing the same task. You put them all together, they give you a better picture of the whole. So it's kind of an interesting analogy for what I'm talking about. Our finite receptions of the triune self-giving multiply each other in a kind of spiritual calculus. Through the incarnation of the Word, this inner koinonia of the Trinity has been shared with a human being, Jesus of Nazareth. And through our human koinonia with that one, the crucified and risen one, we partake in that sharing. And through our communion with each other in the body of Christ, we're able to share ever more of the fullness of God. Now, what does that imply about relation with God through other religions? Well, this, I would say, with certainty, communion is not an identity of contradiction. Because they are rooted in the divine nature itself, each of these dimensions of relation is authentic. If they were not real, the Christian confession of Trinity could not be true. The uniqueness of communion in Christ is not the addition or the alternative of a relation with God that replaces all others. It is the communion fullness of those dimensions, the apophatic mystery of the divine emptiness, the unitive mystery of the divine immanence, the majesty of the divine law, the love and mercy of the divine personal encounter. All of those things are embraced, not denied. Communion is the means by which all may share more deeply in each one, and so share more deeply in the divine nature. So to me that means, as a Christian looking at the other religions, at the spiritual attainments of other religions, at the practices of other religions, means I look through the lens of these Trinitarian dimensions to see what is in order there, what is truly of God there. Now, it's true that as a Christian, I believe the work of Christ has enabled and enhanced all of these frequencies of connection with God. Our estrangement in sin and evil and death distorts and blocks every dimension of relationship, and it's the reconciling, healing grace of God in Christ that's broken down the dividing wall between us and God, the wall of enmity that separates us from each other, the wall of mortality that alienates us from creation. So even in the religions, the achievement of these relationships in some way depends upon that activity, that gracious activity of Christ. It would not be possible for alienation to turn to true realization of divine emptiness, for human egotism to turn to realization of divine immanence, for human willfulness to give way to divine purpose without the breaking down of the barrier of sin that happens at the cross and in the incarnation. Now, the perspective I've outlined here, all too briefly, in my mind offers grounds for a theology of Christian mission that can adequately engage the actual reality of the religions, the mature religious traditions at their best. Oftentimes Christians have theologies of religion that don't long endure very much detailed, concrete, specific contact with other religious traditions. They sound good in theory, but once you actually put them on the ground, they're not adequate to our experience and our reality. But I think this approach also benefits Christian spirituality as well as Christian mission by focusing our minds on the true nature of the gospel, the true nature of its hope. The gospel is not good news or dramatically saving just by contrast with utter loss and torment. Its distinctive character endures. In some ways, it stands out even more clearly in contrast with other ends that have their own authentic good, their own authentic value. The Christian claim for the uniqueness of salvation through Christ and the vocation to invite others into that, all those things remain even while one can affirm and recognize the realities that I'm suggesting. I also think that this framework illuminates the actual experience of Christian missionaries throughout history. It is true that there are times when Christian faith is received as a deliverance from a demonic condition, from a situation of negation. And there are people who find themselves, whatever their nominal religious situation is, in exactly that situation. I was lost, but now I'm found. But it's also true, and all missionaries tended to reflect this fact, that it's also the case that Christian witness to the same salvation can take a different flavor in relation to people of religious devotion and attainment. Not so much the convert coming out of the chains amongst the tombs, more like those who heard Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, "Don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill." So as I've maintained, religions embody a relation with God in some dimension of the divine life, then Christian witness as a flat contradiction of the other's faith is not only likely to be ineffective, it's wrong in terms of our own fundamental faith and conviction. Anyone who clings to the truth of one of those relations in its purity and isolation will never be forced off it by pure negation. The uniqueness of Christ is a reconciling uniqueness. If Christianity preaches a new relation with God, it's a relation of communion that embraces these dimensions of relation that can be found in some measure concretely elsewhere. The Trinitarian example tells us that the simple fact of religious difference doesn't automatically require flat judgments of rejection or acceptance. In fact, and I realize as I read this over, this is a difficult sentence. In fact, what Christians see as the deficiency in the religions, their rejection of the communion relation as fundamental to God and to human fulfillment, that deficiency is also their virtue. That is, it's the particular intensification of that dimension, the particular dimension emphasized in that tradition, that is what gives them something to teach us, something before which we must accept the fact that we are learners before people with some superior wisdom for us. Because these traditions develop an intensity and purity in relation to those dimensions that are for the most part unknown in Christian tradition. So for instance, we have an apophatic tradition in Christian theology, a tradition that reflects profoundly upon the emptiness and the absence of God and the inability of any finite terms to capture God, so on. But that tradition can be deeply, deeply enriched by contact with a Buddhist tradition that has gone much further in that direction. From a Christian point of view, too far, in the sense of cutting itself off from the wider communion opportunities. It's also a great benefit of this approach that it allows us to take the distinctive testimony and practices of various religions on their own terms. This is a huge element when we come to the question of dialogue and relation with our neighbors of other faiths. Do we take their own account of themselves and their tradition and its aims and its accomplishments? Do we take those with utter seriousness? Or do we basically say, no, the way you describe it is not the way it's actually the case. We've already got our theory that describes what must be going on here. In what sense are they the experts about this? I suggest to you that there is a way from this sort of Trinitarian perspective in which we can acknowledge they are the experts. And there is something to be learned here that we do not come to the encounter already in some way in possession of. And it also means we can recognize that they have the ability to interpret our tradition in light of their setting, just as we can interpret theirs in terms of ours. In short, I think it's impossible to believe in the Trinity instead of the distinctive religious claims of all the other religions. The Trinity is a map that finds room for, indeed it requires us to find concrete truth in these traditions. They can be various, these truths, because God's presence in creation is manifest in various dimensions. I mean, the best one-sentence definition of the Trinity I ever heard was from Sam Miller, who was a dean at Harvard Divinity School for a long time. He was a Baptist. Harvard was a Unitarian stronghold, and he was often questioned by Unitarian students, just why do you believe in the Trinity? And Miller finally settled on the one sentence to get people off his back so he could go about his business. He said, well, I think reality must be at least as complex at the center as it is at the periphery. And if, in fact, to make sense of the world, the religious world requires us to address the complexity of that world, I think we find that complexity ultimately grounded in the belief in a complex God, a belief that really sets Christians quite apart from most religious traditions in a very fundamental way. And from this perspective, we can understand how to hold together things that seem contradictory to many. This brings me back to the beginning of my talk today. What's the recipe for being at home with pluralism and also a witness for Christ? On the one hand, there's the firm conviction that there's no salvation apart from Christ and that Christians have a vocation to witness for Christ in every context. And on the other hand, the firm conviction that there is something deeply religiously in order about the different faiths, and that Christians have something to learn from them, even from what is particularly different and contrasting in them. To me, those things are not contradictory. In some ways, they flow together. There is no salvation apart from Christ. When by salvation we know and understand communion with God and other creatures in Christ. That's what we're talking about. There is no way to that except through Christ. But it does not mean that salvation does not include and encompass the dimensions that I've been talking about. The Christian belief in the universal and encompassing significance of Christ is not removed or changed, simply reformulated and deployed. Our witness to Christ is always based on the event of the incarnation as the decisive event of communion in God's relation with the world. But the way that witness works out will always be dependent in some measure on the religious context in which we are making that witness. Whether it's a dimension where it's the first, in a context where the first dimension perhaps is what's emphasized and therefore the personal is what needs to be added, or where the personal is emphasized and what's communion that needs to be added, and so forth. The ultimate ends described by the various religious traditions correspond to relations with God, to true relations with God. But to relations with God limited and intensified within a particular dimension, and by, if you will, a kind of conscious and systematic exclusion of other dimensions. The practice of compassion and mindfulness and insight on the Buddhist way do offer a path to unconditioned reality and release from suffering. And it is based in a real dimension of the mystery of God's apophatic relation with the world. And in that concrete respect, the Buddhist end is similar to salvation. We could even say it's an aspect of the salvation for which Christians hope. But realization of that condition alone would relinquish a whole range of other possible relations with God and others. And the presence of those relations is integral to salvation. In that respect, the Buddhist ideal is similar to what Christians mean by loss. Therefore, Christians cannot ever fail to offer their own witness alongside the Buddhist one about that dimension of communion and fellowship. Now, in a vague and general way, Christians often affirm the religious traditions are part of God's providential purpose. But rarely are we able to take the next step to cash that out and describe what exactly we mean by that. And I hope that this framework that I've suggested in some measure can be a help to us, not just in a theoretical exercise in a classroom and so on, but in our own lives of witness and mission and engagement with our neighbors, in how we frame and understand the experiences of diversity. At the end of the day, the religions play a providential role in God's activity in the world, an activity which is not confined to a narrow salvation history. God's grace enfolds the world and touches it in so many dimensions. And the religions reflect the fact that every human response to any dimension of God's manifestation meets always God's yes of grace to that response. Every response to the divine initiative has its reward. Every relation with God that proceeds on the basis of some aspect of God's self-giving meets the fulfillment for which it aims and hopes. But the Christian hope is that all of those can finally open toward the full koinonia of the divine life that has been shared with us in the fullness of Christ and constitutes an ultimate participation in the divine life of God. To me, that's a prescription for hope, for witness, and for dialogue, such that perhaps in some future time, people like Lindbeck could look back at ours and say, what was it about those people that they could be so comfortable with the dizzying world of diversity around them, and yet so clear about the importance of the gospel and its distinctive voice to be shared with others? That's my hope, that's my prayer. Thank you for your attention. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heim, for stimulating, you can stand here in this carpet thing, stimulating and creative lecture, which I enjoyed very much. But now I also appreciate the fact that you've allowed us some time for questions and discussion in the light of your talk. And while our guests and students are thinking about their question, I'm going to ask the first one. Not my question, but I think a question that comes out of the identity of this community. So if you think of salvation as God's work that is alien and external to us, it's based specifically in Jesus Christ, that comes to us as a word of God, and that God works in us the gift of faith, and we receive it. So this long evangelical tradition of salvation as being justification by faith, apart from works, apart from incorporation into a community. I mean, where do you see that concept of the gospel and salvation fitting into your system or your proposal for mission?
Yeah, well, there's two things I say in relation to that. One is I'd be very honest to say there's a lot in my approach that draws upon Christian tradition that's sort of on the other side of the divide of the justification question. So people like Aquinas, people like Dante's Divine Comedy and so on. I've drawn a lot of inspiration from those sort of visions. But I'm still a Protestant and a Baptist, and the way I think of this is, if you will, the sort of the justification dynamic expanded. Well, I said just very briefly in my talk that from my point of view, it's even possible for the different religions to realize these particular dimensions of relation with the divine, relation with the world. That itself is made possible and rooted in the Christic event and Christ's saving act. So in a way, the religions themselves are justified by an act outside themselves, and an act which they have no control. And so even the Buddhist who works the Buddhist practice, if you will, to attain a certain kind of enlightenment, is doing that on the basis, just as Christians would say about, well, we follow, our faith is not something that we produce, even though we do specific things that are part of our responsive faith. They've actually been given to us by God. I would say the similar thing about these elements in other religious traditions, that in some way they are finally the products of grace and not really of works. But that's taking the paradigm into a somewhat different framework, not acceptable, I've realized, to all.
Well, what theology is. Okay, we have questions then. Yes, here in the front. There's a microphone coming around, if you wouldn't mind just standing up and saying a little of who you are and then ask your question.
All right, I'm Jenny Hinman, and my question pertains to those religions, particularly that don't see a need for Jesus. I'm doing a study on comparative analysis between Christianity and Islam, particularly, and the basic human condition in both of them, in Islam, you are Muslim. There's no fall, there's no original sin, there's no need for a redeemer. So how do you respond in that sense for a gift that has been given to perhaps a belief that doesn't believe that you need it?
Well, two things I'd say. One is, I think you're quite right. There's in a way, my approach works in one sense better for the non-biblical, non-Abrahamic traditions, in the sense that, as is often the case, that when you're not competing for the same turf, you're less commensurate, then there's less conflict over shared elements. But the second point I would say is I simply would say that, in such a situation, the Christian witness is pretty unequivocal. This is a clear difference. The difference in the analysis of the situation of human nature, of the human condition, and of the need that we have for reconciliation and redemption. So at the same time, it's not so hard in the case of Judaism and Islam for us to see another part of that is to say, is there actually a relationship with God in these traditions? It's hard for us to deny there is, because it's based upon so many of the same shared resources, the shared revelation, if you will. So on the one hand, that part's easier. Of course there's a shared relationship with God here. And the witness part, in a way, is sharpened, because we can say more clearly, we share so much in common that the difference has to be some way more prominent. And in other cases, it's maybe harder to say, are we really sharing a dimension of relation with God? But the witness is really so apparent, because even the end that we seek is already a kind of witness on our part to them. So that's, the way I would respond is, as I said at the end, context matters in terms of our mission and our witness. We have to attune it, if you will, to who the one on the other side is. And you have a very particular case that I think you're absolutely right in the way you characterize it.
Yes, Steve, right there. Would you stand up too and just say a little bit about who you are?
I'm just a working pastor.
Uh-huh. Simple, humble, working pastor.
In your framework, would you say that Christian triumphalism, therefore, is actually a denial of the Trinity because it is a negation of the communion of God with other traditions?
Nice.
Yeah, I've never thought about it quite that way, but I would. Usually when someone says, I'm just a local pastor, there's a real zinger coming.
Yeah, there's some zinger coming right after that. Yeah, okay.
But in this case, there was illumination coming on side of it. I think I would say that. Now, my hesitation is that the perspective I've just outlined to you, that's mine, has been responded to differently by different Christians. There are people on one side who say to me, well, you basically sold the store. This is not Christian triumphalism. This is the exact opposite. It's basically giving up Christian distinctive witness. There are others who've said, Christians and others who've said, well, very clever, but really just a very sophisticated form of Christian triumphalism in the end anyway, because at the end of the day, you're saying salvation is the ultimate end, and God desires reconciliation with the world in Christ and communion and so on, to which, both things are true. I do believe the latter, but I do think that triumphalism, if by that we mean the assertion that we as the historical Christian church have the monopoly on our relationship with God, that is a denial of our own fundamental belief. To me, we believe in the Trinity because of the level to which we raise Christ, or we recognize the level of Christ. Without that level of Christology, there can be no Trinity. But once we believe in Trinity, because of that, we have to understand that Christ is not an isolated, exhaustive event. That could not be true if Trinity is true. But we could not believe in Trinity if we did not recognize the decisive, unique role of Christ. So in that sense, I would agree with you.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, so please join me again in thanking Dr. Heim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It was really
For-
very well done. Very well done.
For those of you who didn't get a chance to ask a question, be aware that at 2 o'clock this afternoon, there's an informal time set aside for conversation with Dr. Heim. It'll be up in the Olson Campus Center boardroom. That's at 2 o'clock, informal chat time. You're welcome to come.